This is just about being a human, and you have humans and experiences around you that there's encouragement, there's adaptive experiences, there's less adaptive experiences. And what is adaptive is us developing ways of managing that when we're very little human beings with limited development in different ways.
What if real lasting transformation happens when we're willing to face our shadows, the messy, uncomfortable parts of ourselves we'd rather not look at? And what if the things we avoid out of fear or shame are actually the treasures that wake us up? I'm Cari Jacobs-Crovetto, executive coach and meditation teacher, and this is Finding Treasures in the Trash. Through raw, unfiltered conversations, I invite you to turn toward what you've disowned and begin integrating it back into the whole beautiful human you were meant to be. Your treasure doesn't always live in the light. Sometimes it's buried in the trash. So, grab your gloves. Let's go dumpster diving. Hello, friends, and welcome to Finding Treasures in the Trash. I'm Cari Jacobs-Crovetto, and I'm so happy to welcome a guest. So the last two episodes I've been doing by myself solo, just to really orient us to finding treasures in the trash and a little bit about me, and then a little bit about inner truth work, which is my approach. But today I am so excited because I get to interview one of my colleagues, one of my friends. His name is Henry Most. And before we dive in, I want to tell you a little bit about Henry. So Henry is a professor and full-time lecturer at Stanford in the Graduate School of Business, focused on experiential learning. That just means learning by being an experience. This includes working in the Arbuckle Leadership Fellows Program, as well as teaching the famed Touchy-Feely or Interpersonal Dynamics course. This is a course that aims to help business students grow self-awareness, learn to successfully navigate conflict, and is a fast track to deep personal growth and understanding how you show up. Henry is also an executive coach focused on C-suite leaders or C-suite track leaders. He has degrees in mathematics from Cornell University and a master's degree in integral counseling, marriage, and family therapy from the California Institute of Integral Studies, one of the best schools in the U.S. for therapy. And he's here today to not only talk about his thinking around shadow work, but also to share about his own dig through his trash to find his treasure. So Henry, welcome.
Hi, Cari. It's really nice to be here with you.
So excited. And Henry, you and I have known each other for a while now. I think probably close to 20 years.
20 years, yeah.
Yeah. And we've had different ways that we've oriented to each other.
Yeah, it's very cool.
And most recently, we worked together at Stanford.
Yes, it's been delightful because I didn't know that was going to happen, and it's been this wonderful kind of full circle for our friendship, and now we get to work together and be friends, which is wonderful.
Yeah. So Henry and I first met when we were probably kicking around in our early 30s, kicking around in a different kind of trash, doing different kinds of music festivals and Burning Man festivals. And little did we know 20 years later, we would be living such quote unquote serious lives, teaching at Stanford and working at Stanford together. So you have quite a personal story around your own work on yourself with shadow and your own healing. But before we dig into that, you also have a framework that you shared with me when we were working together one day. And I found it really captivating and really apropos for the show. And so I'm hoping you could just start by walking us through this really cool kind of theory and framework that you have.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me again. And I love how we kind of seem to jibe on the same things. And I remember telling you about this and you being excited about it and thinking about your upcoming podcast. So it's really cool to be here and talk about it a little bit. And just to start, I should say it's definitely not my theory or my framework. It's really a Jungian framework, which means it's from Carl Jung. I'll probably say Jungian, and when I'm saying that, it means that's what it means. It's based on Carl Jung's work. So Carl Jung was a very famous, really psychiatrist, one of Freud's mentees. And he, of course, went through his own journey with this thing I'm going to describe. But it really basically is like this two-part journey that you go through in life effectively. Of course, you kind of have to choose the second half of it, but effectively it's this journey we can go to do what he would call individuate, or become the person we were meant to be, the soul we were meant to be. Sometimes there was this idea of the acorn theory, is that we were this acorn meant to be something, and we had to grow into it. But to grow into it, we have to go through this process that I'm going to share.
And some people like never go, like you said, you can kind of choose to go through the second half, which you're going to share. But I imagine some people like never go through it and they're sort of stuck in acorn world.
Yeah. And as you say, one thing I really appreciate you've said is some people, they're kind of rocking it. They're happy. They're doing their thing. Maybe they are feeling fulfilled. Like I'm very much like not a one size fits all. So this is a framework that's helped me. I think it's true for a lot of people. What I like about it is this isn't a modality. This isn't like a form of therapy. This sort of would be an umbrella that encompasses a lot of what you're doing in different types of growth work, many different types of therapy or other types of workshops or modalities. This is really a framework that you can think of it within. And I think I really like that, because whatever I'm doing in my life, or whatever I'm talking to people about, they can go explore it in many different ways.
On their own too,
Yeah.
right? Like they can kind of do it on your own.
Yeah, exactly. And whatever setting suits them, whatever type of work suits them. So basically the idea here is that in the first half of life, there is what's called the ascension of the ego. And when I say ego, I don't mean narcissistic, full of self ego. That could be part, or inflationary ego, as you might say, that could be part of it. But what we're really talking about here is kind of what you call ego development, a sense of self. But when I say self here, I'm talking about a small s self. And in this idea, there's also the large S self, which is really what we aim for in the second half. But in the first half of our life, and half can mean many different types of years, but we're just going to say half, there's the ascension of what's called the ego. And the ego is mistaking itself for the large S self, but it's really the small s self.
So can you say more about that? Like, what does that mean when I'm like in the small or the large?
Yes. So when we're young, by virtue of being humans in this world, of coming out of the womb and going through the birth canal and becoming human, just even that on its own is a sort of a trauma. Some might say a trauma. We come in, we're super vulnerable as human beings.
Yeah.
And then we have all these ways of this world around us that we interact with. We have let's say we have a disposition. I think we do have dispositions, and then that interacts with the world around us. And in interacting with the worlds around us, we find that parts of ourselves are very welcome and encouraged, and parts of ourselves are not so welcome and encouraged. When I say parts of ourselves, those could be feelings, ways of expressing those feelings. It could be behaviors, all these things. Anything that fits into that realm that's not welcome, it kind of goes into what we can call the shadow. And I know you're interested in shadow work, and that's an important thing for you. So it goes into, it's almost like a unconscious repository. I for some reason, I always put it over here to my right side. I don't know why, but that's where I put it. Like there's this dark repository at the side where these experiences, these ways of being, unprocessed, unencouraged, unwanted, they go in there. And that then creates in us the ways we react to these moments when we find out that we're not enough just as we are. Certain parts of us aren't welcome, treated badly, just could be just whatever kinds of maltreatment. We have ways of responding first of all, in our bodies and emotional world. So something happens in us to respond to this shock of parts not welcome. And to me, something happens, usually that I think of it as stuckness. Something gets stuck. I use a metaphor of a fist, and I think I've heard you talk about this as well. So something gets stuck somatically, almost like a fist in us. And then behaviorally, there's what I call ways of being, the outward manifestations of this inward experience. We develop these ways of being to have acceptance in our family or in our world, basically to make our way through the world. And I'm realizing as I talk about this, we're talking about like unwelcome parts and they go in the shadow, but this is a really adaptive and necessary process.
No one gets out of here off the perfection train.
Yeah. Like this is just about being a human, and you have humans and experiences around you that there's encouragement, there's adaptive experiences, there's less adaptive experiences. And what is adaptive is us developing ways of managing that when we're very little human beings with limited development in different ways.
Okay, so it could be like Like when you were saying that, I immediately had this quick recollection of like my father always telling me I was too dramatic, right? Because I was so emotional, and my dad would well, actually he was very emotional, but he was always like pushing it down. Too emotional. So I had 2 responses. One is that became a drama student, right? Because that felt right for it. But then I also was very self-conscious all the time about how I showed up. Like I was too big, too is that sort of
Yeah, it's interesting. It almost became like a double-edged sword for you. You like some people would give up that part of themselves and not they wouldn't get into drama. They would shut that down. For you, whatever reason, there was something that was going to do that, but there was also this I can't remember what you just said, but like a self-judgment or a shrinking or a something around it. There's all different ways this manifests. Like I think I've shared with you as a very common one, since but we kind of work in higher education some, is perfectionism is a perfect crystal example of this. If you come from a high achieving family and you get rewarded for being smart, getting good grades, doing well, achievement and perfectionism can be a way of marching through the world that works. It is adaptive and actually works in a lot of ways. So that's a way of being. And it's not really bad or good. It's necessary for you in given your set of circumstances to survive.
yeah, I have lots of clients like that.
Yeah. And I'm at Stanford Graduate School of Business. There's tons of really wonderful people who are high achievers that have this drive that serves them in a lot of way. And we'll talk about how eventually that may come not to serve you. Just to give another example, someone may kind of, for whatever reason, have a more rebellious spirit, and they find out that, oh, well, I have the really smart older sibling and don't get recognized as much. So I'm going to become pretty defiant or oppositional so that people notice me. This is like an unconscious strategy, probably tied to the person's disposition, matched with their environment. So there's all different ways. And so you might say, well, how is being oppositional adaptive? Well, for that given person, it gets them noticed by their teachers and sent to the principal or whatever. These are all ways of being. Some of them just happen to be more socially acceptable or successful, but they're all reactions to finding out that parts of us are not welcome. So our first half of our life are leveraging these ways of being one way or the other to move through the world effectively.
Yeah, so you've got these welcome parts that people sort of said yes, yes, yes to, and then these unwelcome parts. And what I hear you saying is the sort of interplay between the parts that are unwelcome and the parts that are welcome as you're sort of becoming yourself.
Yes. And you might have no parts that are welcome and a whole host of ways it can show up. So it's maybe in some people it's a little more of the positive than the negative, but it's really just, okay, there's these experiences and stuff gets sloughed to the side and you develop ways to march through the world, which aren't what you would call your true or authentic self that the acorn wants to be, but they're ways of managing kind of what was unmanageable when you were a little person. This is a really important thing. If you don't do this, you're kind of left floating in a bit of an abyss.
Yeah, you're sort of selfless in a way. Like
Yeah, so it's an adaptive way to move through your development through, let's say, childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood. So here we are with this first half of life, the ascension of the ego. What starts to happen, and it often happens in late 20s, which is really the beginning of psychological adulthood, the end of sort of the brain development, you start finding out these ways of being aren't serving you, either not at all or at least not all the time in the ways you thought they did. And we're very invested in them because a lot of them have gotten us to where we are, or we're so identified with them, we don't really know that there's another way to be because, again, inside it relates to this stuckness. There's not a lot of options with it. So what tends to happen either at this point, late 20s, maybe for some people it's later, it could really be any time. But I think Jung talked about it really in like early 30s was, I think, his conception of it, maybe, if I'm remembering that correctly. The parts that are off in the shadow, that are pushed down, that are held down in the fist, they start to come up. And from above, from our brains and our ego, our small s ego, is pushing down on them. So the feelings are coming up, we're pushing down from above. And if you can see, it's almost like creating this. And we tend to call that anxiety.
And you're doing this just for the listeners that are listening. You're putting your knuckles together and you're creating like an upward with your bottom and a downward with your top. And it's almost vibrating.
Creating a shaking.
Creating a shaking, like a little earthquake starts.
And we might call it, in the West, we tend to call it anxiety. We have a propensity to pathologize and medicate it. In other parts of the world, they might call it a Kundalini experience. Some people might call it a spiritual emergency, and have ways of working with it that are very different. That, and I'm definitely not a one size fits all. So this is not like, oh, I'm tearing down the way the West deals with it, but there is a reality, I think, to how what we see happening when people struggle with these parts of ourselves come up, and really, as opposed to sort of making that wrong or trying to make it go away from this framework, it's really an opportunity. Because what's happening is these parts of yourself that are off in the side in the shadow, they're trying to actually have a voice. They're trying to be expressed, maybe even in just your body. And the idea is, the goal is, rather than avoiding or keeping pushing down, is to actually let them surface and feel sort of, I'll say it this way, feel deeply into them. Feel deeply into these parts of yourself that have been sloughed off in the side. And you can imagine that that is not an easy process.
Well, I hear so much of what you're saying. I just want to do a quick sense making for myself and for the listener. So here we are, parts welcome, parts unwelcome. We're ascending, and then all of a sudden, like late 20s ish. Sometimes people probably don't have this until, could happen anytime, right? Late 30s, late 40s. All of a sudden, there's this rumbling, right? And that rumbling is sort of these authentic parts of yourself that have been pushed down and put in the unwelcome pile, right? You talked about like the dark case to the right. And all of a sudden they're like, knock, 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 knock. They want to come out. And there's this moment where that dissonance creates this energy in the system, in the body, mind, spirit system, which we often call anxiety, which we often medicate, right? Again, I want to say I'm not anti-medication. It's just that what you're describing is kind of like this natural state of individuating, of becoming human, and we're like truncating it.
Or, as you might say, it's the trash that there's treasure in, if we actually explore it and let it be treasure.
Yeah, wow. I'm just letting that soak in. Like, society's sort of telling us like this is still unwelcome, right? Take a pill.
Yeah. Yeah. Or distract yourself or whatever. So basically, if you are willing to go through this process, and this can look, there's so many different modalities, ways to do this, feeling into these parts of yourself, doing it safely. There often can be trauma, and you want to be careful how you plunge in. But in general, let's just say you want to kind of go deeply in. And the idea is you are reclaiming these parts of yourself so that they can be integrated more fully. And essentially, another way to think about it is that fist we're talking about, it's almost like we're taking like a little gentle hammer and chisel and starting to open it a little. Whatever was stuck down there is now opening up, or you could say we're reintegrating these parts of ourselves. And by doing that, theoretically, we're becoming a more integrated, a little more whole version of ourselves. And then the second half of our life, or from that point in our life, it can then become the extension of the self with a capital S. And the ego then subsumes itself, because the ego is still necessary. We still need to march through the world. The ego then subsumes itself back into the small s self that it always really was, but mistook itself for the capital S self. And the capital S self can ascend in the second half of life. When I say capital S self, there's a lot of different words you could use for that. For me, I think of it as like you're a more authentic version of yourself, a self with more choice, more response flexibility, more agency, can drive you, steer you in the second half of life, which often leads to more generative choices and experiences, whether it's in work or personal life or whatever.
Now, I want to get into your personal story around this, but I also want to ask you, because I'm having an aha moment too, which is, I imagine that in the life of a business person, right, or in our work life, we're also doing this same kind of like, who am I as a work person? What's welcome? What's unwelcome? We're ascending in that. And then at some point we become a quote unquote leader, right? And many of the times the shift doesn't happen because I feel like there's also like a break where that small s, large S has an opportunity to move from doing and producing, like, here's everything I produce, here's what I get the pat on the back for, to suddenly how you are. We call that from doing to being, right? Is that kind of the same?
Yes. Yes. I love the way you're saying that. I think there's two aspects I want to respond to in what you said. The first is, yes, when we're in our professional environment and when we're in any different environment, we have different choices about how we show up and which parts of us we bring forward. And that doesn't change even if you go through this process and you're a more authentic version of yourself. It's just there's a little less, what's the word? It's a little less neurotic in the choosing. Like, oh, this isn't the part of myself I'm bringing here. I'm bringing this part. And it's probably a little less chaotic and a little less like, oh, is this okay? Am I giving up this other part? It's a little more choiceful. And I think in some ways, this is all about having more choice, more agency that comes from a genuine part of you versus coming from that fist, an open part of you. So that's the first part. And the second part is, yes, I couldn't agree that, I think we've talked about this some as executive coaches. What we're really working with is the being versus the doing part that's called forth and necessary as people ascend into leadership. Whether that's difficult conversations, feedback up, feedback down, executive presence, whatever it is, it becomes about interpersonal, which generally taps into intimacy things, which generally ties into these parts of ourself that are off to the side. So yeah, I think this is really relevant for the work we do in that way as well.
Okay, let's get into how this showed up for you. Let's dig into your trash, Henry.
Yes. It's really interesting to think about how these things can manifest in terms of the shadow. But I was the youngest by 10 years. I have 3 siblings, 10, 12, and 14 years older than me. All the same family, no step, just all the same family. But I was 10 years later. So I'm taking a deep breath as I start sharing about myself.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's take a 10
it's amazing
seconds.
when you go from up here to now like centering, and it's a different experience in me.
Yeah, you're moving into your body, huh?
Yeah. Feeling into that experience of, so I was this little person basically with what looked like 5 adults around me, even though my siblings were teenagers. But from my view, these were 5 big people all taking care of me. And what's interesting with my family, I would say, is that, well, one thing is that I was treated really well. I got a lot of love. I got more individual attention from my parents than my siblings did. All my siblings were really good to me. So all that actually was pretty supportive and has probably had a huge impact on me being able to march through the world in a favorable way. Parts of me weren't discouraged. But what was really hard in my family is there was a lot of turmoil and dynamics between those 5 people, and especially between my parents. And so I was around a lot of kind of chaotic conflict that repeated over and over and never got resolved. It was never violent in that way. I was fortunate with that. It wasn't like that. It was just very emotionally unhealthy, kind of verbally abusive in some ways. And I was just this little person, right? So I learned early on, or as an unconscious adaptive strategy, when let's say my parents were yelling at each other pretty badly. And I have this very distinctive image of being in my bed at night when this was going on. And I would just tense up my entire body, especially my stomach. I think you've talked about this too. And I relate to you in this like holding somatically my stomach. So all these feelings that were in that moment, which were probably fear, maybe even terror, deep sadness, I was tensing up so I didn't have to feel it. And that was a very adaptive strategy as a little person to deal with it. But all those feelings basically went off to the side because they were unmanageable. And my body almost forming a real fist of itself helped me kind of like what felt like survive, basically.
Yeah, I'm almost getting this image of this chaos around you and this turmoil happening. And there you are, this little person in your room, like almost attempting to stop it with your stomach. Like you could make it stop with your stomach.
An image which actually, it was only really a number of years ago, which I remembered that image of being in my room, even after I'd done a lot of the work we're talking about. So it's amazing how this stuff, the other thing we've talked about is the iterative nature of this. So that was one piece of this. And there's a lot of other things, but I think that's a good solid one to share about me. Like that's been a huge part of my life, unlearning, tensing myself up. And I'm still learning that. And then the other thing I would share that's a little more sort of thematic is my father was 52 when I was born, and he was an eye doctor, an optometrist, and which was fine, gainful living. But he was a really smart man, very creative, and he did a lot of things earlier. Some of them didn't pan out. So he just felt like he didn't really reach his potential. And basically, I grew up with my dad from 52 on at that point in his life, kind of feeling that way. And, I loved my dad. My dad was a very unique individual, which that's a whole nother story. But so I internalized that sense of almost failure or not enoughness. So these are two aspects of me. One is just the somatic reaction to what was around me when I was really small and got a little bigger. And then the other was this story that I internalized. And it's almost hard to say what's in the shadow from that part, but basically there was just a lot of not enoughness. All this stuff got off to the side that I just kind of ignored. Basically, I ignored until I couldn't ignore it anymore. And I share those two pieces because they're really salient for the turning point where I kind of got to the midlife point.
I can see even the emotion that's still present when you go back in time to that first ascension and that small person and how that even through all the work, right? We can still sort of feel that resonance of that.
Yeah. And I think the somatic part is so much a part of my ongoing work. And the dad part, it's really interesting because I've done a lot of work. I'm not gonna say I've completely surmounted that way I internalize that, but I don't talk about it as much anymore. And it's interesting to talk about it and feel into that sadness, which I actually kind of I feel for my dad. It really brings up feelings with my dad and like a tenderness towards him. So yeah, there is a lot there for me in that, I will say.
So then you hit the moment, right? The late 20s-ish, is that when it hits?
It really early, almost mid 30s for me. So I'm doing what I'm doing. I worked after college. I had a really good job. Then I quit. I traveled around the world. Moved out here. And that's around the time I got to know you and was doing a lot of fun things in life. But I was also playing it pretty small in a way. I was working in data analysis, but in a way I was playing pretty small. I was kind of living into my dad's story for myself. I was like, I was gainfully employed, but I wasn't really soaring. I was kind of a reluctant leader, I would say. So I was kind of just in this where I was collecting life experiences, having fun, sort of developing, but there was still just so much like not enoughness, so much tensing against the moment in me. And, what we didn't talk about earlier on is often that shift that we talk about in midlife, that when there's the pushing down and pushing up, the shift is often precipitated by something pretty big, some kind of crisis. And for me, it was a pretty short relationship that was super intense. I describe it, this person as it was like self-esteem by proxy. This woman was, I wanted to go out with, and I was able to, and we really clicked. She wasn't really that interested in being a long-term relationship, but she was developed in certain ways, confident in certain ways I wasn't. And I kind of clung to it for dear life. And, it was very kind of powerful, but also tumultuous. And finally it ended. It was probably 7 months. And I just collapsed. Total, what we'll call ego death or loss of self. And, I smile about it. It was catastrophic in the moment. And it's nice to actually be able to smile about it now. But the thing that was powerful, I was probably 34, and I had done enough exploration therapy, a little bit of some Buddhism. Like I actually had done a fair amount. I traveled around the world. While I was in loss of self, I didn't become self-destructive. I kind of laid myself bare before the world. I was like, I can't force anything different right now. I just have to stay with this. And
so did this feel like, just to make it real, because I'm getting the flavor of it. So you meet this woman and, I love this like sort of ego by proxy. Like she was what you wanted to feel or be, it sounds like.
there was something qualitative about it that was like, it wasn't like necessarily what she was doing in her life per se. It was more like a quality.
The quality of her, right? And then she says no, and suddenly what is it? Depression? Is it anxiety? Is it both? Like what is the tangible emotion that people who are listening could relate to?
It's not really depression or anxiety. I mean, they may have been aspects of it. The best way I can describe it is loss of self. And what I will say is I was on the verge of tears all the time. So there was clearly there was a ocean of sadness that was back there. And this was a conduit for it to come out. But it wasn't like I could tell you like, oh, I'm sad because of this.
Yeah. So almost like a loss of self-resilience. And what comes to me is like these moments, right? These huge life moments where like Pema Chodron says, when things fall apart. And when things fall apart, even if it's a small thing, like I got a bad review or I had a fight with my loved one or my kid slammed the door and walked out, right? Like when things fall apart, sometimes it can feel like a loss of self-resilience, like we're falling apart, right? And you talked about like the tears won't stop coming. Okay, so then you have this moment, and what happens next for you?
So I emphasize the kind of laying myself bare. Like it was falling apart, but it was almost like I couldn't even describe it as that. It was just more like I was this with my hands to the side, like releasing myself to the whims of the world almost is how it felt. So I started, it was funny. I actually was at Burning Man right after this happened, and I was in kind of a mess. But I was talking to a friend of mine, and I was talking about how I wanted to go to graduate. Always had thought about graduate school, and she told me about CIIS actually, which you mentioned at the beginning, which is a very kind of special, unique, kind of mind, body, spirit oriented school. So I was like, oh, it sounds interesting. And then I was kind of, there's always a temple at Burning Man, and I was out sitting there one night. I was there. I spent a good amount of time there that year, and I just sat down next to these three people, and just random people, and they all went to CIS. I was talking to them for a while about myself, and they're like, "Oh, you should definitely come check out the school." They're like, I think you would like it. So that I made it through that week. That happened, and then there was an open house for CIS maybe 3 weeks later. And I went to this open house, and I didn't know what program I wanted to do, but just being in that environment, the physical school, I was like, this is where I belong. Like, this is where I need to be. And I went to an orientation for the program. I eventually did what's called integral counseling program, and that was powerful. The professor did this little example of this work that I now do actually, and it was just very powerful.
So up until this point, you talked about being a data analyst, and I think you were a VP of data analytics, if I'm not mistaken, right? So here you are, this was like the Cornell mathematics part of your life, right? Here you are, this VP of analytics. You have this woman, it ends, you're like, who am I? I don't know anymore. I'm on the verge of tears. I have no idea what makes me happy, which a lot of people get to that question. Like, what makes me happy? Is there more to life? What's going on here? You go to Burning Man and you have this experience, and then you follow that up with CIIS, and you essentially start what has become your current path.
Yeah. I was mesmerized by this work and the orientation thing that this woman did. It's called T group work that you and I now do. And then I was like, okay, I'm quitting my job. I'm applying to this school, and I'm going to go traveling. And I just was like, I knew I was going to get in. I was like, I'm going to get into the school. And I went traveling, and I got in while I was away. And I came back, and I was able to do my job as a consultant and go to school in a weekend program. And, it was that school, that program is known for having to do your own work, which is not true of most MFT psychology programs, interestingly enough. But it's very much there doing your own work. So it was super powerful. So there's two things here. One of the things we did was we started on a retreat, and we did this type of work that's basically a process group or an experiential group. And I had this moment where I was like, I was not the most agile person at it, but I had this moment where I was like, I think I could facilitate these, which again leads to the path that I went down. And I highlight these moments. I'll come back to that in a minute, but there was these moments where I just knew something. I just knew it in a way that I wasn't used to knowing things. And the other part of that was I continued this sort of bearing of myself deeply into somatic work as part of school. And I think I've shared this with you before. I started having these experiences where I'd be walking around town, and I would suddenly feel sadness, and it would turn into just vibrating energy throughout my entire body. And I would just stop on the sidewalk, and I would just feel that sadness, a wave of sadness just turn into vibrating energy in my whole body. And so to me, that was so here's a crisis, here's me opening up to these parts of myself, and then here's me really, really feeling them, like really leaning into them, not trying to make sense of them. For me, it was very somatic, like, whoa, I'm just letting my body feel all these things that have been off to the side, unexpressed, stuck in a fist. So those moments of knowing, or first the synchronicity, the serendipity of the people I sat down next to and went to CIS, the feeling when I went to the school, the feeling when I went to the orientation of the program, the feeling when I first was in this type of group that I now do. And then after school, when I got the email about the facilitator training program that I went to, there was just these moments of knowing that I hadn't had before. And I didn't think I was the kind of person that was going to have those moments. And when I say knowing, I wasn't making like a rational choice, or even, it didn't even feel like choosing. It was like my body and my gut are moving in this direction and I'm just going in that direction. And that came directly from this bearing myself and just letting enter and responding to what was. And that really has led to, if you look at what I'm doing now and pretty fulfilling work that I do, it really came from that being open and feeling into these parts of myself, and thus being able to pay attention to what was in front of me in a way that I hadn't before. So it was like a different way of knowing for me. So that's the first important piece. And the second important piece is I had to learn your question about, does everyone need to do this? I was doing work that I liked before, and I was kind of a reluctant leader, but I'm very existential in nature. Like, I'm kind of like everything is meaningless at base. So if I'm not doing something I'm really connected to, I'm not going to really lean into leadership and sort of taking risks in a certain way. And so I was judging myself for a lot of years, like living into my father's story, et cetera, et cetera. But in reality, I wasn't really doing something I was fully connected to. And when I was like, oh, wow, I actually do want to lead, or I do want to keep trying new things. So it was a really powerful shift from it shifted the somatic blockage, and it shifted that story I had about myself. So that's really been, when I talk about that ascension of the self with a capital S, that's the last 15 years have been the beginning of my ascension of that self. And hopefully there's more. I don't know what's to come, but hopefully there's more to come.
Your story is so powerful. And you did a huge about face, right? Not only did you like dig in your trash, like you jumped into the dumpster 2 feet, rolled around, like got the banana skin on you, the whole 9 yards. You composted yourself and reemerged. That's so powerful. Some people will want to do that and be drawn to that. Other people will be like, well, maybe I don't want to dive in 2 feet. So in this sort of average daily moment, what could this look like? This turning in, finding the moment, even if you're not 28, even if you're 38 or 48 or 58. Like, what does that moment look like when you go back? Like, you have this moment that you said where it's like, who am I? What's really happening? What is this unwanted part that's shaking and quaking? And how do I go in and turn that into treasure?
Yeah. I really appreciate you naming that, because I don't expect that everyone needs to, has to go through this huge crisis. I think there are a certain amount of people who do, and it's really powerful when they go in. But in reality, and I know this is something you and I talked about, even after this whole situation, and even after I shifted my life towards work that's way more meaningful to me and that I'm connected to deeply, I'm still going through this process I've described sort of iteratively in much, much smaller ways. And for me, what that might mean or look like is in a moment when I'm feeling whatever it is, tension, or I'm spun up in my head, or I look at it as there's something below my neck that wants to be expressed, that wants some attention. And this is very much, I've listened to your podcast, so that I know your inner truth work and the steps, like, this is just, it's a version of that effectively. It's how do I pause what's happening in my brain, in my sort of human part of my brain, and breathe into myself and just allow my heart and my body some space. And as you say, that could be a minute, it could be 5 minutes, it could be 10 minutes, it could be an hour, it could be a meditation retreat. But I will, sometimes I walk down the street and I do this process where I'm like, okay, something annoys me, walking down the street, and it's like, okay, can I pause and breathe? And, then I can have more curiosity about myself. I can have more curiosity and empathy about what's outside me. So to me, the somatic's very important to me. That tends to be my orientation. And from talking to you and listening to you, I think there's a kinship there. So to me, it's this whole framework I'm sharing, and crisis and transformation, like it could be that, but it can also just be carrying around a practice of I'm going to pause and breathe into myself.
Does it always have to be an unwelcome part, or can it be like an unwelcome experience?
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting question because I mean, really, there's what happens and there's our response to it, right? So, I mean, you could make an argument that when we're responding to something and when there's an unpleasant response in us to something, it's always tapping into something that's maybe something we don't like to feel or look at in ourselves. But I guess you could argue there's some objective things that happen that are pretty unpleasant and that we might all feel a little similarly. But whatever the case is, what tends to happen is something happens in our body and then our human part of our brain goes to work making a story, often blaming or criticizing or having contempt towards what's outside, or maybe turning it on ourselves and having contempt or anger towards ourselves. And so those are all secondary responses to there's something unpleasant happening in my body. And so if we can kind of get down to the true sort of in the moment, which we do by pausing and actually breathing into ourselves, then we can give space, let that energy move, and then we have choice about what we do in that moment versus being beholden to it.
I love this. I mean, this is like another way. It's another expression of how we find treasures in our trash. And I'm so grateful, honored to have you here. You're our first guest officially. And what a way to kick it off, Henry. Thank you so, so much to our listeners. I hope this was helpful. Test out the framework for yourself. Look at your life. I always say to my coaching clients, take a moment, take stock, find out where you are in your life, feel what you feel, and then take a dive. All right, Henry. All right, listeners, thank you so much.
Thank you, Cari. It's been great. I feel like we could talk for another 2 hours.
I'm sure we could. Maybe we'll have you back on. Thanks again, everyone. Happy digging. Thanks for spending time with me and for having the courage to listen inward. If you'd like to continue the journey, you can find me at bravedirections.com, and there you can sign up for my newsletter and something really exciting. If you're ready to begin exploring your own inner terrain, I've created something called 5 Days to Truth. It's a complimentary 5-day meditation journey that helps you start gently digging into your own trash and discovering what's there waiting for you. So until we meet again, be kind to yourself and trust what's emerging, because inside the muck lives the gold.
Thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to a Magic Thread Media podcast.